one of the subjects that I've heard most talked about over the last few days, certainly over the time of my humble little self-isolation here, working from home, has been education in the broadest possible sense. On a simple level, what the hell do you do with your kids all day? And then on a kind of a broader perspective, how do you keep up with your own continuing development in a time like this? Luckily, there are people who have been working on these questions for quite some time. Among them, our next guest, joining us from London, Atish Gonsalves. Atish is an innovator in the distance learning space, a field which I feel is going to be a lot more important as well as a lot more popular than it has been. Atish, tell us, how can you learn using a mobile screen or a small laptop? The kind that for most people. How is that even possible?
Hi, Rolf. Yeah, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I'd start first by saying that education really hasn't changed a lot since the Industrial Revolution. So I mean, in terms of how we've been educating children, how we've been educating university students, people for the workforce is broadly been sort of in these sort of batches, and it's been also increasingly quite knowledge driven. So there is a sort of false choice in terms of when we look at learning between very engaged, well facilitated workshops, which tend to be in person, not always, and online learning, which tends to be associated with self-guided, what I call PowerPoint on steroids, or on a little mobile phone, you click a few buttons, and that's great. It has its place in some cases around knowledge dissemination, but it's not necessarily learning. Learning should be much more experiential. It should be much more practice-based. I mean, if you think of like a pilot, they would go through a vast amount of theory, but you will not put them into a plane without having them go through a flight simulator. We need to have that same sort of thinking for other types of skills, whether they're soft skills, quote unquote, or more technical skills. So in terms of the effort to democratize learning and not just knowledge, the democratization of knowledge started with things like Wikipedia, where more people had access to information. Democratization of learning started with things like Coursera and edX and Udacity. So these kinds of initiatives making experiential practice-based learning opportunities more accessible to the public. So we've been sort of doing this within the humanitarian sector through things like the Kaya platform that we've been using to train aid workers and volunteers around the world, and not just through massive open online courses or MOOCs or through self-guided learning, but through things like virtual reality as well, which we've been starting to roll out even on smartphones, where people are not just learning why it is important to protect vulnerable populations and work in really complex situations, but actually practice those behaviors by being in a virtual simulation and doing that virtual simulation on a simple smartphone. So it's not just seeing the smartphone, to your question, Ralph, but actually engaging with that smartphone and having a conversation with the virtual character. So moving much more towards sort of behavioral learning and practice and game-based approaches. I would say that the other part is also about making learning much more human and much more social. And again, now with our self-isolation that we're seeing, we're doing simple things like virtual lunches together over Zoom, or we're seeing virtual yoga sessions, etc. But if you think about, again, the most memorable trainings that you've been through yourself, it is quite often the subject matter that you've been able to get there, but it's been sometimes the sort of informal conversations or breaking bread together. And so how can we challenge ourselves to also bring more of that human to human element into the learning, bring in more coaching where we are encouraging and actually building into the instructional design or the pedagogy that human to human element and support, and opportunities for people to engage with one another, either one-to-one or one-to-many.
Of course, because technology and skills, as important as they are just part of the equation. Psychology, habits, rituals, in fact, are probably far more important in order for the skills and the knowledge to be imparted successfully. It sounds like a really difficult problem.
Yeah, no, I think it is, and I think what is even more hard now, and I think what we've been sort of promoting, and this goes back a bit to sort of the design approaches as well that we look at. For good learning to be designed, you need to ideally involve your learner or your user in the process, and that usually involves things like design workshops where you're going through the entire design process. And usually we've done this locally with grassroots organizations. Again, very difficult in this sort of context, but it's doable. I think it takes effort. Dare I say, it takes love to put that effort into sort of really building that connection, really hand holding people and saying, this is a new technology, or this is something new we're doing, and going through that process and working with your end user and audience to create meaningful learning and to create learning that is relevant and accessible. So how can we run a design sprint, for example, with multiple users over Zoom, for example? And actually, there are the additional digital challenges, but there's also really interesting opportunities, because now you can design a learning where you have people involved in that process who are from very different geographies and different cultures. And this opens up huge opportunities even at the school level, where students are learning together with classmates from their neighborhood, but they could also be learning with classmates from around the world. So I think in all of this challenge, there may be some interesting opportunities, and people may finally challenge what learning really is and what knowledge is, and how we also try to involve users even over digital.
On a perhaps somewhat more down-to-earth note, do you think we're going to be seeing an increase in online education in what our mothers and fathers used to teach? How to cook, how to garden?
We're definitely seeing, I mean, just over the last few days, I mean, if you've seen sort of your LinkedIn feeds, there's a
the last
lot
10 days we've been somewhat preoccupied.
There's a lot of organizations, particularly in the sort of space I work around online learning and adult learning and corporate learning. There's a lot of organizations offering everything from soft skill courses, remote working, motivating teams. So there's definitely people are seeing the market opportunity here. I think the challenge will be sort of working out which are sort of what are the things which are really going to add value and going to really support in this crisis, in this challenge right now, and where are just companies who are seeing a commercial opportunity and pushing a product. So I think it'll be difficult, but you're already seeing that. You're already seeing quite a lot of interest and acceptance by organizations who traditionally would have been quite reticent to accept online learning as a format.
And that indeed sounds like another very difficult problem, because the whole of the earth has not been covered with a technology layer where I can go out into my garden and turn on my phone and somehow connect to a lesson that tells me where to plant carrots and potatoes, because of course that is exactly what I'm going to do next week. We don't have that layer of technology available, certainly not everywhere. So the temptation perhaps that you just mentioned may be to do more of the same thing, just ever so slightly different. But we're now in a time where doing the same thing really is not sufficient. So somehow this technology layer is going to have to be introduced by people who think differently. Are you seeing, or hearing rather, people asking those sorts of questions in your world?
I mean, it's quite early right now, and also the world that I work in the humanitarian sector, there's already quite a big digital barrier in a number of sort of areas that we operate in. So even when we talked about digital learning in the humanitarian sector, we would accept that there would be sort of a last mile where digitally it would be quite hard to reach, and then you have to equip the last mile volunteers, aid workers with the tools that they can take offline. So there is
But
clearly.
then by the same token, we've not in the last fortnight.
Ralph, I think we may have lost you.
I think so.
Whilst we're waiting for Ralph to connect, I think just trying to guess what question he was asking. So I think, yeah, I think there's going to be challenges around how do you get learning digitally for communities who've not had access to digital, whether for cost or for reach, and also introducing digital into new areas like we were talking about. Non-sort of professional types of jobs, so looking at even things like farming and social things where we normally would not associate digital learning. So I think there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that the barrier doesn't then become even bigger for people who do not have access to the technology.